Good morning, church. Glad you're here this morning. If you're visiting with us, I'll give you a little disclaimer about what you've wandered in the middle of. This is the end of our, 2 more weeks, but the tail end of our series on 1 Peter. We've been walking through 1 Peter, and we've called that alienation because Peter uses a word that can be translated aliens over and over and over as he's talking to the exiles, the strangers, the sojourners that he is addressing that letter to. And we've kind of looked at this over the course of a few weeks, and we're going to end up, if you have your Bibles, we're going to end up in chapter 5 today if you want to go ahead and get that pulled up, or pull out your smartphone and pretend to look at it or whatever. I make that joke all the time. It's a joke. I really think that you're actually looking at your Bible and not playing Candy Crush or whatever. So anyway, so we're glad you're with us, and that's what all this is about. I remember when my Uncle Otis passed away. He was actually, I guess technically would be my great uncle. This was my grandmother's brother, and they loved each other. I mean, they loved each other. Growing up, we were always either going down to their house. They lived down in Beaumont, or they were coming up to our house. They would take vacations together. They were tight. And so when he passed away, it broke her heart. Right after he passed away, we were sitting at her house, and a few people came by. People from church, one of whom was an elder in our local church. And as we sat there and we talked, this elder began to question and talk about my uncle, who he had never met, but he was concerned because my uncle was also an elder. He actually passed away, he had a heart attack in an elders meeting. And, I've been in a few elders meetings where I thought I was going to die, but not here, Jimmy, never here. But never actually had that happen. He had a heart attack in an elders meeting, but he was an elder at a liberal church down there in Beaumont. And this elder was saying that he hoped being affiliated with that church didn't tarnish Otis's crown now that he had gone on to judgment. I'll never forget those words because they really stuck in my head. Some of you know I've told you that I had a brief period that I like to call the lost years, right after adolescence, where I was the typical rebel without a clue, and kind of ran around and did everything that I was big enough to. And as you can see, I'm pretty big. And so this was at the tail end of that. So I still I wasn't very pastoral at that time. So this man proceeded to talk about my uncle and this church, because at some time there had been some flooding or some storm, as there always is in Southeast Texas. And during that, this Church of Christ had partnered with other churches in the area to minister to the needy and the people who were displaced and affected by those storms. And they had culminated and come together in a worship service where they all came together. And this elder who was speaking thought that was inappropriate because, people that serve Jesus shouldn't do that together. And I don't understand it. There was a lot of speaking about silence and being silent where the Bible's silent. There was a lot of talk about command, example, and necessary inference. If you don't know what that means, be thankful. There's a lot of talk about, doctrine and all this stuff. And to be honest, I wanted to punch him in the mouth. Because I'm sitting there in the couch in my grandmother's living room. She is mourning the loss of her brother. And this man is sitting there hurting her with his words as he talks about a church he's never been to and disparages the memory of a man he'd never met. And I wanted to punch him in the mouth. I didn't, because of respect for my grandmother and my grandfather, who were sitting there quietly. I later asked my grandfather, why didn't you punch him in the mouth? Because it was a legitimate question for me. This man was obviously hurting my grandmother. Why didn't you throw him out of your house? And he said that the Bible calls us to be respectful of elders even when they're not being respectable. Those words stuck with me too. And so, as we come to the end of this study of 1 Peter, we're going to see some talk about elders. Now, before you sit back and say, man, Jeff really gave it to those elders this morning, let me tell you that I believe that a lot of this may be our fault. And by our, I mean yours and mine, members, people in the pews, not just the elders. And that's hard to hear. I don't know about here because I've never done it here, but where I grew up, when we did elder selection, it became a caucus. It became a political process. And you could always tell when elder selection was coming up because you had some men who started kissing babies and shaking hands and did everything but put a sign in their yard. I mean, you knew it was coming, right? Because those guys started working the crowd. And they were trying to get elected because that's what we did. We did it as a democratic process, and we elected elders, which is very American, not very scriptural, but very American. And as we got into that, it became one of the most divisive things I've ever seen in a church because it broke us into factions. And so you had a faction that supported one guy over here, and you had a faction who supported another guy over here, and you started splintering. And the preacher would get up and give lots of sermons about qualifications of elders. Have you ever heard any of those? You kind of like, at one point when we were doing an elder selection, I remember when I was a young person, that they printed up a checklist and passed those out so you could check and see if your guy met the checklist. And that you would get all these qualifications, right? Had to be a husband of one wife. We heard a lot about that one. I mean, I can remember lots of sermons about people who had to be a husband of one wife. Now, I grew up in that church, and I never knew any bigamists went there. But apparently they were there somewhere because we were worried about them a lot. There were some guys somewhere who had 2 or 3 wives. I don't know if they hid it well or what, but we were worried about those people. They had to be sound in doctrine. And if you don't know what that means, that's code for believes the same as me. And so they had to be sound in doctrine. They had to have believing children. And it didn't matter if the children were 65 years old. They had to be believing children. And he had to rule the household. I remember hearing that one a lot. Still not sure what that meant, but that's just me. But we would get all these qualifications. I say all that to say one of the things you never heard about, one of the passages that you never heard talked about a great deal in all those lessons was our text this morning. In 1 Peter chapter 5. Turn over there. Because as we wrap up this talk about these aliens and how they're going to interact with this world, Peter begins to address the elders. And in chapter 5, verses 1 through 5, he's going to talk to them. And let's walk through this together and listen to what he says. So I exhort the elders among you, as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed, shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Peter addresses here a lot of our ideas about church leadership. And I want to take a few minutes to walk through this. And you may be sitting there thinking, well, this doesn't apply to me. I'm not an elder. I'm not going to be an elder. But if you're going to be in church, you're going to participate in that process. And it's real important that we understand some of the things that Peter has to say about leadership in churches in this passage. The first one I want us to note is that it's plural. All the words that he uses are always plural. That's important because it implies that it's not just a one-man show. A lot of churches are now beginning to go back and look at their leadership model because they're realizing that a plurality of elders, having more than one, is more a biblical model than the traditional pastoral model that a lot of people have, a lot of churches have, where it's just one pastor running the show. That a plurality of elders is much more biblical because that's one of the things that you see when you're looking at passages like this, that it's plural. Peter uses three of the big buzzwords that are used today to talk about church leaders. Three of the words that you will hear being bandied about. One of those is presbyteros, which is translated presbyters or elders. It's where you get the Presbyterian church from that word. The idea here, though, is that this person is a little bit advanced, a little bit wise, maybe a little bit older. Traditionally, it has a lot to do with age. Unfortunately, we don't always like this, but being an elder means you have to be a little elderly. It doesn't really work that way all the times in our churches, and that's on both sides of the coin because we have younger people who want to step into leadership, and we have older people who say, I'm done, it's retirement time. You've heard my saying about that. Christianity has a great retirement plan, but it doesn't start until after your funeral. So when you say, I'm done, I did my time, that doesn't really wash. Part of it is being older, being more advanced, being wiser, having some wisdom. Now, if you think about that, when Paul writes to elders, he starts talking about finding the people who are already doing the job of an elder. It's not an office. It's not something you run for. It's not something you campaign for. So we'll address that at another time. Peter uses this word first, presbyteros, elders, guys who are a little bit more advanced in years. And that's all that means. He also uses poimen, which is translated shepherd or pastor. Now that's important because if you remember, Peter was given a call, right? After Jesus is raised and they have that breakfast on the beach. You remember that story? And what does Jesus tell him? Shepherd my sheep. That made an impact on him because that's what he's writing here. Here, shepherding is a verb. It's an action. It's something that's done. Now that's important because there are a lot of people who miss that today. We miss the idea that shepherding is active. He says shepherd the flock, shepherd God's flock. You know, in those times the shepherd very rarely was the owner of the sheep. He was usually a guy that was hired, and his job was to protect those sheep, to look after those sheep, to manage those sheep, to make sure that they were fed, to make sure that they were cared for, to make sure that they were safe, right? But he wasn't the owner, just the same way as those of us who were put into leadership in God's church. This is not Jeff's church. This is not Jimmy's church. This is not any other person's church. This is Christ's church. And we are given an opportunity to help manage that, to shepherd. Shepherding is active. It's not something that can be done from a stagnant position. That's important because if you're a shepherd, if you aspire to be a shepherd one day, I'm going to tell you, and our current shepherds would back me up on this, that only about 10% of what you do as an elder happens in this conference room. There's a lot of churches that don't get that. They think that all eldering happens around a conference table. But the truth is, you can't shepherd sheep from a conference room. You have to be among them. You don't see any shepherds with cushy chairs and a big fancy table. You see shepherds with a little crook thing, and they're out there. They're sleeping outside, right? They're eating with the sheep. They're living with the sheep. Lynn Anderson a while back wrote a great book called They Smell Like Sheep, and that's one of the whole points, is that shepherds are among the sheep. So it's not about edicts. It's not about executive actions. It's not about pastoral rulings. It's about participation in the lives of the sheep. And that's important because another fallacy that we get from our American political system is that it's about constituency. This is not a constituency. Do you know what that means? That's where you have a group of people who support you, and you go to Washington to advance their special interest as a representative. That's not eldership. That may be American political government, but it's not eldership. See, shepherds don't have constituencies, right? Shepherds don't wait for sheep to tell them when it's time to change pastures. Shepherds don't make their decisions based on what sheep want or don't want. That's why the constituency model is pretty much not what Peter has in mind. It's not what Paul has in mind. And so when we start dividing and saying, well, this guy's our guy, he's gonna support what I believe, so we're going to push him to be in there and to carry our agenda forward, that's great for government, but that's not scriptural for the church. We need people who are going to be able to shepherd. That means doing things that sometimes offend sheep, or doing things that sometimes make sheep uncomfortable. And we don't like to be called sheep because that's kind of offensive, but that's the biblical word. That's what we're called in Scripture. Those of us who are in the church, we are the flock. And whether we like it or not, that's it. That Chris Seidman gave a great presentation on this at Tulsa when I was there this year. And he said, shepherds don't wait for sheep to tell them when it's time to move pastures. And that's true. Shepherds have to make these decisions on their own. That's not just shepherding, though. That's leadership. The third word that Peter uses is episkopos, which is translated overseer or bishop. But that word is always used in the ancient world to refer to somebody who's managing, who is a manager, who is taking care of business, okay? And so he's saying, be an overseer, but don't be an overlord. You don't have to be better than everybody else. That story that I told you about that elder in my grandmother's living room was about a man who really enjoyed hearing himself talk and couldn't understand why the rest of us didn't share that enjoyment. And it was about overlording. He was an elder, and therefore we were all supposed to kowtow to his wishes. And that's not scriptural. Being an overseer is not being the master. We get that confused with the plantation overseers in American history, but that's not what it's about. It's being the servant. It's being the manager. Peter wraps it all up with a simple word that pretty much every time gets left off those lists of qualifications. That word is humility. Because that's one of Peter's prime qualifications for an elder, is being humble. That's different than what we look for, isn't it? I guarantee you it wasn't on that list they printed out when I was a kid. Let's go back and look at it again. Clothe yourselves. We read this today. All of you with humility toward one another, for God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. The literal translation of that passage goes like this: and all being subject to one another, put on humility. Because God sets Himself against the proud, but offers His grace to the humble. That's huge. This is not just about leaders. This is about all of us. This is about those who are being subject to one another. This is about submission. Remember, Peter's already talked about submission before. Earlier in the book, he talked about submission in the church. He talked about submission in the workplace. He talked about submission in the home. And now he's coming back to that here again at the end. And he's saying, in humility, be subject to one another. You leaders need to be subject to those who you are leading. And you who are being led need to be subject to those who are leading. It's all about that mutual submission. It's about humility. See, that's the key. Peter understands that's the key. Because in order to hate somebody else, in order to push somebody else out, or to separate or to divide, you have to minimize their value. Right? Nobody in inner city, wherever, shoots another person for their tennis shoes unless the value of that person's life is less than the value of those tennis shoes. In our churches, it's the same thing. In order for me to beat you down, to push you down, to push you aside, I have to minimize your value. And the only way I do that is by dividing into factions. Because I can't minimize another human being if I perceive them as being more valuable than myself. That's the key. Because when I look at you and see your interests as more important than my interests, I can't trot on you. I can't get mad that you want what you want. If we could catch this, can you imagine how this would revolutionize our world? Think about this for a minute. If instead of worrying about my interests, if I literally lived my life worried about the interests of others, how would that revolutionize the world we live in? Let's bring it down. How would that revolutionize the church? I can tell you, it would cut out a lot of the divisions that we have right now. For example, you got a group of people who thinks that we need to have instruments in the church in order to provide a more contemporary worship service to reach out to those around them. You have another group of people over here who was raised that instruments are wrong. We should never bring those inside a building. Yes, I'm going there. It's okay. Calm down. He's really talking about this? This is real, right? But if this group and this group both viewed the other's interests as more important, how would that change things? Instead of my tradition, if I'm worried about you, how does that change things? And I think there's a way we can do those things. I think we can find ways to coexist. Jesus never prayed for division. Jesus never prayed for churches to be splintered apart. He prayed for unity. And so if this group decides, you know what, we're going to have a Saturday night service with instruments where you can reach out to those who are interested in that thing, and then this group says, okay, well then we will commit that at 10:30 on Sunday morning in that auditorium, we promise, we put it in writing that we will never have instruments in that worship service. And you can rest easy that we're never going to try to infiltrate that. If we can both look out for the interests of others, all of a sudden, we can find ways to coexist. Now, to do that, your interests have to be more important than mine. And that's hard. Gandhi once said that he thought Christianity was a great idea. It's just too bad nobody tried it. That's the idea. What if we actually did what the New Testament teaches and put others above ourselves? What if we actually did what Peter's saying here and humbled ourselves and viewed other people as more important than our own interests? I think it would make a church that was clothed in humility and that was bathed in grace. Peter says the alternative is if we continue on our course where we're all prideful and we're all holding to our traditions and we're all fighting with one another, God is against us. Now, I don't know about you. I don't ever want to be in that place. I don't ever want God to be against me. I want to be on the side of grace. Period. God opposes the proud. And if my tradition, if my way of thinking makes me so proud that it would put me against God, That's my choice, but you're on your own. He gives grace to the humble, because then you have a church bathed in unity, a church bathed in humility, a church that can grow together in faith, that can bring hope to a dying world, that can be a light known by their love for one another. That's our mission statement. That's the church that we want to be. This morning, if you want to be a part of that, we want you to be a part of that. If you haven't become a Christian, we encourage you to take that time this morning and to let us just shut down everything else we're doing and to join with you as you put on Christ in baptism, as you're raised to walk in newness of life. Have you become a new creature? That's more important than anything else we're doing. If you're struggling in your daily life, and I'm going to ask a few people, we're a little light on elders, so I'm going to ask some prayer partners this morning to partner in with that. So Bob and Jeanette, if y'all will go back there, and Jim Bob, will you join Jimmy and Cindy when we have this invitation? Anybody else that wants to, feel free. But at the back of the room, there's going to be people who will pray for you. And so if you need prayer, you go find one of those people. We put them at the back of the room because we're not trying to single you out. It's not about a walk of shame. It's about you going with someone to the God that is in heaven that can make a difference in whatever's going on in your life. That's what this time's for. So we're going to stand. We're going to sing a song. I encourage you, whatever God is putting on your heart, humble yourself, find that, and let's be that church this morning. Come now while together we stand and sing.